All right, here's the video that I promised you.
The following case illustration is of a 20-year-old with a unilateral choanal atresia. The patient failed endoscopic sinus surgery and adenoidectomy was found to have an atresia plate. The CAT scan showed a posterior heavy bone
right there.
inferiorly and medially. The nose is filled with mucus because there's unable to drain. Posteriorly, there's nasopharynx is clear. Viewing in endoscopically, we can see that there's a blind pouch. Suction cautery and a spatula cautery are used to cauterize the mucosa over the atresia plate. Once the bone is exposed, a small opening is seen inferiorly. A kerosene forceps was placed here to remove part of the atresia plate medially. The septum's on the right, the inferior turbinate is on the left. As we expose the bone, we can see into the nasopharynx. We can see the suction going through the left side into the nasopharynx. Again, cautery is used to remove the overlying mucosa and expose the bone. This heavy bone needs to be drilled. A 2.9 millimeter drill on a Medtronic shaver is utilized for this case. Inferiorly, the ledge also has to be removed. Image guidance is useful as it defines the superior and inferior limits and the medial and lateral limits of the plate. The kerosene is used to remove the plate inferiorly and laterally. A power shaver is also utilized to remove overlying mucosa, as seen here. Is removing the mucosa over the posterior septum. An adequate opening is seen into the nasopharynx. The eustachian tube is on the left. Residual adenoids are posteriorly, palates inferiorly. No packing or stents were required.
All right. Okay. So choanal atresia can be very serious, especially if it's bilateral choanal atresia. Unilateral choanal atresia is not going to be as serious. That being said, both could require surgical procedures to fix them. So within the nasal cavity, we have nasolacrimal ducts that drain. Nasolacrimal ducts actually keep our nasal cavity very moist. So when air moves in, we moisten that air. So the nasal cavity not only pulls air in, but it also warms the air, it moistens the air, and it helps to clean that air. One of the interesting things about having our nasolacrimal ducts run from the lacrimal canal into the nasal cavity is that we have a very moist nasal cavity. When it gets really, really cold out, the cilia don't move everything around as effectively, and so water ends up condensing. And that causes a runny nose, which is why in the wintertime when you're outside you get a runny nose much more often. Another thing that happens is if you have if you start crying, so you have some emotional response to something, you start crying, you're going to have an overflow of tears. So you have the lacrimal canal is draining those tears into the nasal cavity. They're also coming out. And that's why when you cry, you also have your nasal cavity gets very filled and you end up having to blow your nose. Kind of interesting, right? We have nasal sinuses associated with our nasal cavity. There are 4 basic nasal sinuses, or 4 groups, I won't say basic, 4 groups of nasal sinuses. We have 2 frontal nasal sinuses, 2 ethmoidal, 2 sphenoidal, and 2 maxillary nasal sinuses. And so the function of nasal sinuses is to lighten our skull cap, our skull. Instead of having compact bone, there's these holes in there that help our head to be lighter so that it is able to be held up properly. But also, they have a lot of ciliated mucosal cells that can get rid of potential pathogens, trap pathogens, get rid of pathogens before they cause disease. They help to make our voice sound louder so we can resonate our voice farther out. So they have a lot of important functions, but sometimes they can cause us problems. And so here you can see the nasal cavity, or not the nasal cavity, the nasal sinuses. These are your frontal sinuses. This is your ethmoidal and your sphenoidal sinuses, and then there's your maxillary sinuses. And so if the sinuses get blocked, if we get an accumulation of potential pathogens and mucus in an area, that can cause us to have sinus headaches, and sinus headaches are very painful. So you can see the mucus here, you can see the inflamed sinuses. One of the treatments is using what we call a neti pot. So this is something that we can do at our house. There are different types of neti pots. I like to, hold on, I like to give a forewarning. I'm not promoting usage of the neti pot. What I'm telling you is that neti pots can be useful in cleaning out your sinuses, but if you use them, you need to use them properly, and you don't want to use just basic tap water. You need to use distilled water or boiled water that has cooled down. You don't use boiling water, obviously. They have special salts that they put into the water that help in cleansing your sinus cavities. And so this is just a little video that goes through, or that talks about the neti pot. So I'll let you guys watch it.
Good thing. I've recommended it to people. It's been recommended to me. I'm sure you've recommended it. Definitely. I mean, about 90% of people think this is heaven sent. This is the best thing for their sinuses. It really does flush those sinuses. It's a sinus lavage. You're basically ready to do this?
I guess so. I mean, I have received 2 this year as gifts, so I know how popular they are, but they are sitting under my bathroom counter unused.
It's a little daunting. Basically, do you know what this is? Do you know what we do? Yeah. Well, let's see if we can do it. You want to try?
I'm in this with you.
All right, let's go. I'm going to try this. Ready? Hold the towel. Just here we go. Yeah.
I can't believe I'm doing this one.
Hold your breath. Like
I think it got on me.
There we go. There we go.
I can do it.
You can do it. Go ahead.
If I'm going to do it for the first time, it's going to be here with you guys. So learn from the best.
What's really important is as you're flushing, there's little hairs inside your nose, and that's called cilia. And what you're doing is you're letting those hairs become clean again and actually work and get rid of all the infection. Look, no hands. It is actually a great treatment for sinus congestion, even sinus infection sometimes for the people with recurrent allergies. It can be an adjunct to treatment. But of course, talk to your doctor, ask your doctor, make sure it's something. Make sure it's appropriate for you. Again, don't diagnose yourself and then start applying remedies till you talk to your doctor.
Excellent. Excellent. thought process there. So, if you've never used a Neti Pot, they can be helpful to some extent. A lot of people like them, but I just tell you, please follow the directions and don't use basic tap water. Don't use regular salt. It's not going to be effective, and it could cause more problems, actually. And so here you're seeing what a sinus infection looks like, just another picture showing there's bacteria that have gotten in, and they get trapped and they start replicating, causing swelling. Typical treatment for sinus infections, you're going to get some type of an antibiotic if it's caused by bacteria, obviously. If it's not caused by bacteria, they might give you some type of a painkiller, and they might prescribe certain nasal openers, like nasal sprays that will help to increase the ability of your sinuses to open up. The next region is your pharynx. The pharynx is just a tunnel. That's all it is. It's a little tiny tunnel that runs from the choanine at the back of the nasal cavity all the way to the larynx, which is right here. So you have a nasopharynx, you have an oropharynx, and then you have a laryngopharynx, and it's just your throat, okay? The pharynx actually is found in both our respiratory and our digestive systems. So we not only take in air through it, but we also take in food. And again, you can see the nasopharynx up here, the oropharynx, and then the laryngopharynx. Sorry. So now we're going to go into the larynx, which is the next structure of the respiratory system. And then we'll get into the trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles. So we've done the upper respiratory tract. Now we're looking at the lower respiratory tract, but we're also looking at, we're finishing up the conducting pathway of the functional respiratory tract, okay? So the larynx is known as the voice box. It is a small airway, very short airway, that leads from the pharynx to the trachea. But it has a lot of functions. So it obviously passes air. It also prevents food and drink from entering the respiratory tract. That's one of the most important things. And then it produces sound. So here are what we call our vocal folds. Here's the pharynx, or the larynx. The top of the larynx is called the epiglottis. And here's the larynx when it's opened. So that's the trachea right in there. And again, there's your epiglottis. The vocal folds are going to vibrate as air moves through them, and that's what allows us to produce sound. The epiglottis, which is right here, is what covers our trachea. So it covers the top of the larynx. It's the top of the larynx, and it covers it so that food doesn't go into the wrong tube. Have you ever heard, oh my God, I swallowed and it went down the wrong tube? We actually have two tubes right there. We have a trachea, and then we have a esophagus, an esophagus. So what it does is the larynx covers the trachea so the food only goes down the esophagus, and drink also. Inflammation of the larynx is known as laryngitis, often associated with yelling. So if you're at like a concert and you're screaming, or you're somewhere else and you're making a lot of noise, that can cause you to get laryngitis. Symptoms of laryngitis are very hoarse voice. Sometimes you lose your voice completely. You have a sore throat. And if it's caused by bacterial or viral infection, it can actually lead to a fever and just overall lethargy. If the laryngitis runs to the epiglottis, the top of the larynx, so again, this is your epiglottis, it can lead to epiglottitis. And epiglottitis is the inflammation of the